Hello, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to DigiCap. If you happen to watch live, we're just about in the middle of this 2-week conference hosted by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation on digital capitalism. How is the pandemic shaping our digital future? Many panels and webinars, interview, and the 3-hour kickoff a week ago, if you could watch that. Obviously, we cannot assemble, but the foundation has put a lot of cognitive and technical effort in still making this a lively event of exchange and discussion. And this will happen today also, about, I think, 45 minutes into this event. I will speak with my colleague, moderator Géraldine de Bastion, is here for you today as advocate of the audience. So there's the possibility of asking questions on Twitter under the hashtag DigiCap. She will bring in your questions from Twitter about 45 minutes from now. I'm still looking forward to that. So a week ago, just to give you a brief overview of what this is all about, we started out by looking more at the consumer side of things in digital capitalism. Some call us users, even, like a drug user, so to speak, and that end of the equation. But Shoshana Zuboff said, no, we're not users, we're citizens. Then we also talked about the idea of the common good in digital infrastructures with Philipp Stab and Tilman Santarius. Then Saskia Esken was here, the co-chairwoman of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party here in Germany, and she told us about what policy can achieve and what it cannot achieve. And the following day, with Bart de Witte, we gained insight into possible futures of the medical sector. Today is going to be different. We're going to talk about not so much as you as consumer or citizen, but as worker or employee. It's called, this conversation, The Economy and the Labor Market in Crisis, Is the Pandemic Accelerating Change? Matthew Taylor will be with us shortly from London, a truly distinguished expert on the topics we want to discuss today. And I will introduce Matthew properly after this welcoming message from Rainer Hoffmann, president of the DGB, Deutscher Gewerkschaftsbund. He's the chairman of the German Trade Union Confederation. His message fits very well with today's program, actually. It's just under 3 minutes and in German, but there is translation. We have many interpreters here in our venue to English and Spanish if you need that. See you in 3. Here's Rainer Hoffmann.
Dear colleagues, the corona pandemic has kept us at our toes over the last weeks and months. Due to courageous policies, the utilization of short-term work, recovery program and many other support programs, unemployment could be prevented from occurring. We managed to secure jobs, but we've also observed that the world of work has changed profoundly in recent weeks. We have seen that individual sectors really fell deeply into the crisis, but online trade is up and running and these dealers make extra profit. Many people in recent months have worked from home. They had to work mobile, and they have gained various different types of experience. We in the trade unions need to do everything in our power at the current moment in time in order to navigate as safely as we can through the crisis. We need to protect the health of our workforce, but we also need to be prepared to adjust. For the trade unions, of course, this means that we put the human being into the center. That holds particularly true for mobile work. In the digital world of work and the support, we've seen a lot of things will change. What is most important to us is that human beings can see that their entitlement to more self-determination and gain more self-time management will be guaranteed. We need to focus on the risks, reduce too much workload, avoid exploitation, and mobile work must not take us back to old role models between the different gender. We have learned that particularly women are subjected to tremendous strains. This is why it is of the essence that we enter into collective agreements with the HR reps and the Works Councillor. It is right that the Minister of Labour, Hubertus Heil, wants to guarantee our right to mobile work. But all this will only be possible if we ensure that collective agreements will be adhered to. Also in the digital world of work, we need reliable framework conditions, and they can be secured in the best possible manner if we have strong works councillors and strong collective agreements. This is why it is important for us to talk about the way in which we can give shape to digital capitalism in the future and give it a human touch. This will be in the center of your conference today, the fourth conference, which is part of the Digital Capitalism Congress. I wish you exciting and fruitful discussions, good ideas, and courage to bring about change. Every possible success and the best of luck.
Thank you, Rainer Hoffmann. So what Hoffmann calls humane labor and the digital transformation probably isn't too far from what our guest tonight, Matthew Taylor, would name good work. Matthew was the chair of the Review of Modern Employment established by the then Prime Minister Theresa May. It was actually named after him. The Taylor Review, or Report on Good Work, was published in the summer of 2017. Before that, he worked for think tanks on public policy. He was an advisor to Tony Blair, too, and at one time head of his policy unit, actually. Since 2006, he has been the chief executive of the RSA, the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce in the UK. And at the moment, he is also at Interim Director of Labour Market Enforcement for UK Government. It's very nice to have you with us, Matthew. Welcome to Berlin, so to speak.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Let me start with a scandal in the labor market that hit the UK this summer and fall. There was not that much reporting on that in Germany, actually, so I thought it would be interesting to hear for a German and an international audience. I'm, of course, talking about the prominent textile industry of the city of Leicester in the East Midlands. There have been many cases where pay was about half of minimum wage, even in the textile industry, in the garment district, right at the center of the city, actually. Plus, some factories did not provide, proper working conditions that adhered to the hygiene rules under pandemic law, so to speak. Also, there has been some cases of massive tax fraud, actually. So quite a mess. Some call it modern slavery, even some commentators did. And I really hope you don't mention the German meat industry in return here, Matthew, in our discussion. But let me ask you, 300 investigations in a period of 18 months in this garment industry in Leicester. What made this crackdown possible in the first place? Was it the role of digital technology in some sense, that it was easier to blow the whistle for some people, or how did that come about?
Well, thank you. So perhaps I should start by just explaining slightly my role for the government. So the government has a variety of agencies that are responsible for elements of labour market compliance, ensuring that the rules, the regulations covering employment are carried out. And three of those agencies, one of them is part of our Treasury, and that looks at minimum wage enforcement. Then we have another body that licenses businesses in the agriculture, fisheries sector, but also looks for severe labour exploitation bordering onto modern slavery. And then we have a third body, which is part of our business department, which oversees the work of employment agencies. And what my office does is it assesses the work of these three agencies and also undertakes research into the underlying problems of non-compliance. And one of the big things that we're looking at now is that the government, the Conservative government, is committed to bringing those three bodies together, possibly with bits of other agencies, into a single enforcement body. And so that's a conversation that I'm spending a lot of time on. Now, in relation to Leicester, Leicester really came to light, I think, first because of increase in COVID cases. So Leicester was one of the first really big kind of clusters outside London in the southeast, which took place in kind of late spring, early summer. And it was clear that some of this was to do with what was going on in garment factories. Now, the problems of the garment industry, which is a kind of square mile of Leicester, a city in the English East Midlands, had been known about for a long time. It was an open secret within the garment industry and had been reported on in the past. but it had not been acted on. And it's interesting to explore why it hadn't been acted on. The reason it really came to prominence was because of these health and safety issues. So it's often the case when you have a lot of non-compliance going on, the thing that eventually emerges above the surface is quite unpredictable. In this case, it was health and safety concerns, people not social distancing, not wearing protective equipment. And that led to more undercover investigations by journalists, which also revealed issues around the non-payment of minimum wage, and then further journalistic investigations, which revealed that a lot of work had been done looking at tax abuse, non-payment of a value-added tax, for example, other types of tax fraud in Leicester. Now, why has it been so difficult to tackle? Because, the big question that I've had to deal with from the media and others and ministers have had to deal with is, given that these issues were an open secret, why was it so hard to do anything about it? And the main reason for that is an issue actually in many labour market enforcement regimes. Just been reading a paper by David Weil, who was an advisor to Barack Obama about these issues. And it's to do with the fact that agencies are generally speaking required to be responsive. So they respond to complaints made to them by workers. And because in very few countries is there sufficient resource for labour market enforcement and compliance, the resources are tilted towards where the complaints come from. And for example, in the UK, the minimum wage enforcement body is statutorily required to respond to every complaint that it receives from a worker. Mm. The problem in Leicester was that there were very few complaints.
Oh, why is that?
And this is because these were issues which were taking place within a community, and not entirely, but largely a community of South Asian heritage, and where, for a variety of reasons, sometimes people themselves didn't feel themselves to be victims. They were maybe involved in benefit fraud themselves, so they were signing forms saying that they were working fewer hours than they were working in order that they could claim benefit top-ups. So there was quite a lot of complicity going on within the system. So that's the first problem, is the issues weren't surfacing. The second problem was that although some of the coverage of what's gone on in Leicester suggests that there is very severe problems ranging into modern slavery, the evidence suggests that in terms of labour market non-compliance, actually the main problem is minimum wage non-payment, which is not at the severe end. It's very important, don't get me wrong, it's extremely important, and it's the single biggest form of non-compliance, and it's very important that we tackle it in a whole variety of ways, the non-payment of the minimum wage. But the problem is that, generally speaking, non-payment of the minimum wage is not a sufficiently severe offence to justify things like kind of dawn raids in factories or undercover work. That kind of investigative work would not normally be justified by what is seen as a relatively minor infringement in comparison to, for example, a modern slavery. So that was a second issue, that the powers of the agencies were not that great as long as the evidence suggested that the form of non-compliance was at the level of non-payment of minimum wage. It was when COVID and health and safety came in that increased the power to be able to intervene, because there seemed to be a very strong health and safety issue. And then the final issue is to do with interagency collaboration, which is that we have different agencies looking at this issue, and each of them have got different sets of priorities. So the body, for example, that was responsible for health and safety in the UK, the Health and Safety Executive, I think 3 years ago, downgraded the risk it could see in the garment industry, because it had visited these factories and found that whatever else their problems, they didn't look as though they presented very high-level industrial risks that you might see in a chemical factory or heavy industry factory. So this is pre-COVID, of course. So what you had was different agencies having a different assessment of the kind of problem here, and not having the capacity to come together and say, well, look, actually, if we look across the piece, tax evasion, potentially immigration issues, non-payment of the minimum wage, health and safety, potentially a greater risk of severe labour exploitation. Put it all together and you need to intervene. Now, that's what's happened since the summer, and it seems to have had some effect. The challenge is that once the media gaze has passed and once the agencies feel they've had an effect and they then go back to the kind of day job, the danger is, will it grow again? So Leicester has been, in the UK, or certainly in England, it's been a very important kind of way of looking at the weaknesses and of our existing system.
Thank you for that clarification, Matthew, there. So there's really multiple reasons for, how the scandal played out. But let's stick to pay a little bit in relation to good work and digital capitalism. You stressed in your report 3 years ago that pay is only one aspect in determining the quality of work. Now, if you take, let's say, the workers in the garment industry in Leicester, or even gig workers elsewhere for digital platforms like Uber or Lyft or other ride services, what are the other overriding aspects apart from pay in the low-wage sector that actually do determine the quality of work even there?
Yeah, so the issue of work quality, is incredibly important, and I've been pleased to see that this issue, quality of work, has got onto the agenda in the UK, partly, I like to think, as a result of my report, but also because we had a pretty strong labour market. And when people are not worried about the quantity of work, it gives them scope to start to think more deeply about the quality of work. Now, of course, that begs the question, which is, if we're moving into an era of much higher unemployment, what's that going to mean for the good work agenda? Maybe we can get into that in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to work quality, it's important to recognise two important things at the outset. The first is that our feeling about our work is subjective. Different people get different satisfactions out of work. Different people want different things out of work. Some people say work is terribly important to their sense of meaning and purpose in life. Other people say it's much less important, have a more instrumental view. And secondly, your experience work is contextual, in the sense that if you're a pizza courier working for a platform app, in your summer holiday as a student, in order to earn money to spend in the bar or the club at the weekend or to pay for your holiday, that's a very different thing to being somebody who is the main earner for a low-income household who's dependent on that income to be able to pay the bills and pay the rent and be able to survive. So it's just important to make those 2 points. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, still there is a strong body of research now that tells us, broadly speaking, what the components of good work are. And, of course, pay is one of them, and the less well paid you are, the more important it is. So generally speaking, the more you're paid, it becomes less important as you go up the kind of pay curve. And once you get over about kind of, far above, once you get much past average earnings, it becomes a less significant factor. But fairness of pay is also a factor. So it's not just how much you get paid, it's whether or not you think what you get paid is fair, in broad kind of absolute terms, but also in terms of your colleagues, in terms of what's going on in your organisation. So that's one element. Another element is, and this goes to the issue around kind of the digital economy, is flexibility and kind of work-life balance, and whether your work can be reconciled with the other kind of demands that you have on your life and how you want to live your life. Autonomy and work design is important. So generally speaking, people who have more autonomy, more choice over how they work, are more satisfied, and people who have very limited choice, who experience strong control, have less satisfaction at work, which is why the whole kind of issue of surveillance capitalism is very important issue to discuss. The RSA has done research before COVID, and we asked people about their perceptions of technology. What was interesting was that some workers thought their job was threatened, but many more workers, indeed a majority, thought their work would get deteriorate. They didn't think they'd lose their job, but they thought their work would deteriorate. It would be intensified, and they'd be subject to more control. Management is an important issue. The quality of management, the quality of leadership of your organization, the purpose of your organization. Teamwork, social support at work is also an important kind of factor, and kind of psychosocial well-being, which is also associated with that. And then there's the possibilities for progression and for personal development. Is this a job where there is a viable path to progress? Is this a job where you learn skills? Is this a job that increases your kind of human capital? So these are, broadly speaking, the different kind of elements that go towards an assessment of whether of people's assessment of work satisfaction.
I think definitely reasons like autonomy and flexibility play a large role in the gig economy, as we have just seen in California, where Proposition 22 was voted on. But there's another key factor of good work I found really interesting in your report and in your other writings, Matthew, and that is having a meaningful say at work, working in an environment that is less hierarchical, so to speak. And we really know about that in Germany. Ask us about Dieselgate at Volkswagen, the emissions scandal that probably would not have been that grave if there had been a different culture of participation within the company. We know that by now, I think. Now, digital tools could facilitate the process of participation greatly within a company. Do you see an increase of workers' participation due to digital tools in home office, of having a say, so to speak, in your experience at the RSA or elsewhere, especially since the pandemic started?
Yeah, really important issue, and worker voice is exactly as you say, an important component of people's satisfaction, both worker voice through kind of formal routes like works councils, but also simply a broader sense of being heard and respected at work. And I think I'd want to answer this question really in two parts. The first part is really to say, we in the UK simply envy the tradition of co-determination and worker voice and participation that you take for granted in Germany, and is a very important part of your system. And from my perception, here in the UK, is one of the reasons why, in the face of crises, whether it's the global financial crisis or COVID, you're able to bring together the partners, business, trade unions and government, and agree ways forward. Interestingly, it's a very interesting thing that in England, although we have a Conservative government, and Conservatives have been associated for the last kind of 30 years with antagonism to trade unions, our Chancellor brought in the trade unions very early on to help him design the furlough scheme and other schemes. And I don't think number 10, I don't think Boris Johnson has engaged with the trade unions, but certainly his Chancellor has. And that's an interesting example of one of these questions, which is, well, things have happened during COVID. Will they be persisted with afterwards? Will we see the trade unions pushed out into the cold in the UK again after COVID has passed? Or will these forms of dialogue continue? Very interesting kind of question. And in my report, I propose some very modest steps in Britain towards greater kind of voice at work and rights and consultation with workers. It's not a strong British tradition for a whole variety of reasons, and we really need to take it forward. The second part of your question is fascinating, and that's about what's happened during COVID. And certainly what I have seen is that hierarchy has been subverted in quite important ways. So at a kind of trivial level, there's nothing like seeing your boss's home furnishings or domestic pet or small children running in front of them in a meeting to kind of puncture their pomposity. We have seen, I was talking to the chief executive of a major retailer in Britain recently, and he said that, well, he was the chair actually, he said the chief executive used to do a kind of 3-monthly, quarterly talk to the staff that was rather boring, and he'd come along and give a kind of pep talk, and people didn't really pay any attention. During COVID, he's been doing a weekly fireside chat A lot of employers, partly because of working from home, but also a much greater sensitivity to issues of well-being, have been surveying their staff almost continuously to see how people are and how people are doing. So I think this has really challenged hierarchy, and hierarchical systems have been put to one side. Performance management systems, for example, put to one side. Organizations have had to work in a more flat, more autonomous way. They've seen their staff stepping up in all sorts of interesting ways to the challenge. But the problem is that you still need hierarchy. I mean, I absolutely believe in much flatter, more better engagement. I believe in cooperatives, worker control, all those kind of things. But I still think organizations above a very small size do need some kind of hierarchical system, and the evidence suggests that that is the case. The question is it a benign hierarchy or not? So I think, I do talks for leaders a lot at the moment, and one of the challenges I say leaders face, I use the phrase, hierarchy is dead, long live hierarchy. And what I mean by that is that the old hierarchical systems have been subverted, and we need to invent a more intelligent way of doing things, because ultimately still the leader, the boss, whoever, has to make hard decisions. That's what they're paid to do, and they can engage in all sorts of issues, and they should hand over more issues to their workers. But sometimes the buck has to stop at the top. So I think one of the really interesting questions for a lot of organizations going forward, particularly if their hierarchical systems have been subverted, is how does leadership manifest itself in a post-COVID world? Will we simply return to the old form? I think we won't. I think I've noticed a lot of leaders having to change, and also quite a lot of leaders saying that they've realized they don't want to go on that much longer, that they've tried to lead through this crisis, but maybe they've learned the limits of their leadership style.
Let me play the devil's advocate for just a second here, Matthew, and ask this weekly fireside chat. Where do you draw the line there between the illusion of participation and empowerment and real empowerment that actually does lead to change? I mean, the weekly fireside chat might just, it doesn't have to lead to anything, right? I mean, if you just do that and no measures are being followed after that. So where do you draw the line there? How would you define good participation and, let's say it, fake participation?
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And, as I said, the situation in England is way behind the situation in Germany in terms of workers' rights, for information, for consultation, for participation, and we've been, because we've had Conservative governments now for several years.
We do too.
They've looked at various ways of addressing this, and they always kind of pull up short of doing anything like the system that you have in Germany, and that's something that I continue to push them on as hard as I can, and maybe there will be a shift now. So I completely agree with you. And I have arguments with, human resource managers who say, well, why do I need a staff representative council? Why do I need representation? We do a weekly newsletter. We have a social events, et cetera, et cetera. And I say, this is ridiculous. This is like saying that because governments try to treat people well, you don't need to have elections. There's a difference. You need rights, actual rights, as well as good kind of personnel practices and fireside chats and communication and all of that kind of stuff. And, ultimately, I also strongly believe in models of, cooperative models, mutuals. I believe that workers should have a stake at work. And I often cite Elizabeth Anderson, who wrote a book called Private Government, American philosopher, in which she argued, and this is very much about the American system and the British system, that, we at work, we are subject to the same kind of regulation that government can impose on us, but we don't have the rights that citizens have in civil society. And indeed, in my Good Work report, when I argued for good work, including strengthening rights to voice and representation, one of the reasons I said good work matters is citizenship, because I said there is a disconnect between what government says about citizens in civil society, that they should be involved, engaged. In the Brexit referendum, the phrase was take back control. Well, I said, how can you have that rhetoric for civil society, but then it stops at the door of the factory, the door of the office? If you want active, involved citizens in society, you should want them at work as well. So I completely agree with you. I think you need an underpinning of guarantees and rights. And And then on top of that, you want a culture which is friendly and open and engaging and bosses who are emotionally intelligent.
I absolutely admire your optimism there, Matthew, but there's also, I perceive several notions of backlash, actually, in this crisis. One backlash is, you've talked about that too, in other panels, that, when it comes to gender imbalance. We see more women working less hours in the pandemic than men, and that happens even in academia. There's much less citations by women researchers than male ones. That's one thing. The other one is a phrase that is going viral, so to speak. It's a wrong metaphor now, I know, but that is getting to be quite well known. I think Joe Biden used it a couple of times, even Boris Johnson, I believe. And the phrase goes, "Build back better." And both things sort of point toward a backlash where I think, do people really want to rebuild the status quo ante, so to speak? This is not something that points to the future, but it points to the past, actually, in terms of gender imbalance and in, getting the world from before COVID back into the picture. How is this going to work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complex question, and I don't want to give a very long answer because I want to carry on hearing more questions. But look, in terms of the gender issue, yes, that's right. That's what the research shows. I think there's probably a significant difference depending on whether or not you have children at home. And I think it's particularly where there have been children at home when they locked down, closed schools and nurseries. And that is particularly where women found themselves bearing the brunt of that. And that had an effect on them at work. I think, broadly speaking, when one looks at gender in the labour market, it's important to recognise that what has happened over the last few decades is that professional women have fought very successfully to close the gap. The gap has not entirely closed, but there has been significant progress, not just in Europe, but around the world. In fact, even more dramatically, actually, for example, in Asia, the developing world, women's entry into professions and women's movement up those professions. Still, as I say, the gap is still there, particularly at the very highest level. But at the same time, you've also got the concentration of women in particular roles which tend to be have lower status and lower pay. And many people, I think, would say lower status and lower pay, which is really inexplicable when you think of the actual work. And I'm talking particularly here about care. So I think that one of the issues that's certainly come up in COVID has been that the care sector, in England and I think in other countries, has been really exposed to the problems of that sector and the problems of the way in which people are paid and treated in that sector. And I think that one of the things that came up in COVID, which is an opportunity for us to change the dialogue going forward, is a recognition that market value and social value don't necessarily go together. Because, when this crisis was at its worst, and it's still, of course, very bad in many places, we needed care workers, we needed nurses, we needed doctors, we needed couriers, we needed people in warehouses. Corporate bankers, not so much, So I think that this question of the relationship between market value and social value has been opened up in quite an interesting way. Now, what you do about that, that's another question, but I think that is interesting. And again, to be fair to the British government is committed to raising the minimum wage over the next 4 years to the poverty level. So there will not be poverty pay in Britain. And that's a remarkable commitment. And it's important that they're held to that when COVID has passed and we're facing the economic challenges that we have. But look, what I always want to say when people get into this kind of conversation about, what's going to happen is I want to say, let's not predict, let's organise. Because I think if you look at the history of the relationship between crisis and change, which is something that I speak about more generally, so I'll be very brief, it looks as though the reasons that crisis lead to change, because crisis doesn't always lead to change, it doesn't always lead to benign change. The factors that determine whether crisis leads to change seem to be, first of all, was there a build-up of desire for change before the crisis? Because change doesn't come from nowhere. Secondly, in the crisis, were there certain things that happened which prefigured a different kind of future? One example might be the way in which lots of governments have used things that look rather like a universal basic income. Not exactly universal basic income, but similar in many kind of ways to a universal basic income. So you see the feature prefigured. And then critically, as you emerge from the crisis, do you have the practical policy ideas and the political coalitions necessary to take advantage of that greater openness that people have towards change? So this is contingent. You know, it's contingent on the conversation where these kinds of conversations and the political organization we have and the practical policy ideas that we have got. It is up for grabs. You know, and, you know, Joe, you mentioned Joe Biden. Joe Biden's victory will change things. It will hopefully, for example, give real impetus to a fundamental shift of the global economy in a sustainable direction. And that will have all sorts of kind of ramifications as well. So I would see this as a moment of opportunity. And I try at all times, and this is true, by the way, when it comes to kind of technology, I try to avoid the prediction game because I think in a way it disempowers us because it makes us focus on, well, what do we think is going to happen rather than, well, what do we want to happen and what would be involved in trying to make that happen?
One thing to look at the difference of, you know, social value and market value of work is maybe to look just for a minute at productivity and compare the UK and Germany there a little bit before we probably want to go on to discuss why this transition is turning out to be so hard, or maybe very hard. On a recent panel discussion, you said that it takes a British worker 5 days while his fellow German can do it in 4. So that productivity in the UK is actually lower than in Germany. What would you say is the reason for this? Does it actually lie exactly in the quality of work, which in this line of argument would be higher in Germany? Do you actually think that? And do you think it's somehow related to the dual training system, to the vocational education, Berufsausbildung, as we call it here in Germany, that we have? Is this something to aspire to, or are there other factors coming in for this, to me, surprising figure, you know, that productivity is higher in Germany than in the UK?
Well, yeah, I mean, we talk about the productivity puzzle in the UK, and many academics have spent an awful lot of their life trying to get to the bottom of that productivity puzzle. And I don't think we entirely have. You're quite right that there is a productivity gap, and it's pretty significant, and it shows no sign of improving. And there are various factors associated with it. I think it's certainly something to do with the much better skills and training system that you have in Germany. I think it is partly to do with higher capital investment. I think it's partly to do with having a larger manufacturing sector, and productivity gains have been consistent and pretty fast in manufacturing. We have a service economy, and productivity gains are much harder to achieve, have been much harder to achieve in the service sector. So there's a whole variety of factors involved here. I personally think that management is quite a big part of this. I think that we do still suffer in the UK from a kind of command and control model of management. Okay. We view worker involvement as something which is somehow going to impede innovation and entrepreneurship, which is complete nonsense, because actually it's when you listen to your workers that you actually can discover opportunities for innovation, and you will get more motivated, more committed workers. But unfortunately, there are some rather old-fashioned attitudes still to be found in British industry, and certainly we have a really big issue about quality there are lots of elements to this, but if you forced me to say choose one part of why it is Britain's productivity lags, I would say it's the quality of management, and I would link that to a kind of model of control which is partly involved in our resistance to more participative forms of workplace relations.
You probably figured that we like to be flattered, right, Matthew?
Well, listen, I tell you, on my podcast, I interviewed John Kampfner a few weeks ago, who's written a book all about the lessons we should learn from Germany. That's one of 3 or 4 books published this year in Britain in English about how we should, have a bit of humility about the lessons that we could learn from Germany. So I'm not alone in my inferiority complex towards you.
No, I just wanted to tell you actually that the absolute numbers in dual training are decreasing quite rapidly. Not dramatically, but considerably in the last, I think, 10 to 15 years, about 15% or something like that. So we see change there. But let us talk, about why it is so hard to enforce a good work for more people. Let us talk about two factors you have written about before. One is consumerism on one hand, going into high debt. You have very high debts, personal debts in the UK for many people. That's on a large scale. But there's also what we call now a cognitive elitism, that we value cognitive work much higher than work of the hand and of the heart, so to speak. So if we're about to fight high debts, if we want to tackle this consumerism that does impede change, apparently, to good work, because it's always there. High debt, you have to have higher pay and so forth. Quality of work will be second in line and not first in line, right, if we talk about this. So, but what does this mean in a trajectory? I mean, does it also mean less growth, which is, kind of a specter looming there in the discussion? If we tackle consumerism, we're talking about less growth. And then it gets scary for some people. What would you say then?
Yeah, so I'm so pleased you asked me that question, because I think that, I work for Tony Blair. I'm a moderate, a pragmatist, an incrementalist. But yet, that's not because I don't have a vision for a very different kind of world. It's just the way in which I think you have to go about getting to that world. I worry a lot, by the way, this is a separate conversation, but it's a blog I wrote earlier this week if anybody wants to check it out. I worry a lot about the split between the kind of radical activist left and the moderate kind of pragmatic left at the moment. And I think it's a very big issue, and it's part of the reason why the broad left has tended to be on the retreat in recent years. So, and I think that part of that is because I think that the radical left thinks that moderate people on the left don't really want to change society. And that's not true. I just think it's about how it is you get there. So I'm delighted you asked that question, because I do have a vision of a world where all work is good work. A world where work is the way in which we fulfill ourselves. It is part of our story about living the best life that we can live. And, that's clearly not the case now. So surveys find that about 70% of people say that their work is okay. But when you ask deeper questions like how engaged do you feel at work, then the number is much lower. If you ask, are you using your skills fully at work, the number is much lower. There was a survey a few years ago in the UK which said to people who are about to retire, what will you miss most about work? And by far and away, the top answer was nothing at all. So, I think that we do need to say that a good society is a society where work is simply part of being who I am and living the best life I can live. And I'm interested as to what are the things, the deeper things, which undermine that kind of vision, which surely should not be too idealistic. The thing that we spend, getting on for a third to a half of our adult pre-retirement hours on should be something which we find fulfilling and satisfying and even joyful. So I think the things that stand in the way of that are things we've started to talk about, and I'll be very brief, but we talked about one a lot, and that's control. Mm-hmm. So I think if people feel at work that they are subject to control, they don't have autonomy, they don't have voice, they are not partners, then I think that's a big issue, and that's why all the conversation we've already had about worker voice and participation, but also different ownership models, cooperatives, etc., is very important. The second, and these are 4 C's, by the way, that's the first C, control. The second C is competition, which is, in the end, people want to do something that has an ultimate purpose. And too often in our economy, but not just in our economy, or sometimes in our public services, people feel that all they're doing is work environment, that all that matters is competition, out-competing in the marketplace or out-competing in public service measurement systems. And I think that, one of your greatest thinkers, Max Weber, brilliantly analyzed organizations. And he said that one of the things that happens in organizations is that substantive goals, ultimate goals, the thing you're trying to do in the world, get pushed out by procedural goals, what is following the rules. And that happens in all organizations. And I think the main reason it happens, particularly in the private sector, but to a certain extent in the public sector because of new public management, is that we think that instead of focusing on achieving something in the world, what we produce and what we do and what our organization does, we are obsessed with competition as a means to an end. And I think ultimately, people do not lie in bed, in their deathbeds, saying, my life was meaningful because I improved shareholder value, right? So that's the second thing that we have to think about, is that people's work needs to feel that it is for an ultimate purpose of contributing something that society values, not merely being part of a kind of competitive kind of hamster wheel. Then the third C is consumerism. And in arguing this, I'm not arguing against consumption. I'm not arguing even against growth, actually. I think it's possible to have green growth. What I'm arguing against is an instrumental model of work that says, well, I'll put up with my work because it means I can buy stuff. And as you said, in an economy like the UK, where there are very high levels of economic insecurity, a big contributor to which has been the encouragement of debt. And so a lot of people feel they have to work incredibly hard just to pay the bills. Well, you don't have scope to then say, well, actually, I want my work to be meaningful, because you just need work to pay the bills. And I think that in a better society, our identities would be more based in our productive work, what we produce, and less in our identity as a consumer. And, Henry Ford is a critical figure here, because Henry Ford is the person who imposed the ideas of F.W. Taylor, the kind of time and motion ideas in his factory, and said the critical thing is that my workers can afford the cars that they make. And you can understand the attraction of that. But that notion, that instrumental notion, that it doesn't matter what your quality of your work is, as long as you can buy stuff at the end of the week, I think that's a problem as well. And I think that's not great for human fulfillment, because actually I think the fulfillment you get from production and creation and providing a service is greater than you get from consuming stuff. And there's lots of research to back that up. And then the fourth C is the one you mentioned, which is this cognitive bias, which is that we have seen over the last 20 or 30 years that we have societies which assume that good work is cognitive work. And we have a kind of cognitive elite, and the growth of professions and the growth of management consultancy and the growth of people going into higher education. And many of those things are not problematic on their own, but I think overall what it's contributed to is a sense that work of the hand, practical work, trades, crafts, and work of the heart, and I talked about care work, is somehow less important. It's lower status. It's less well paid. And we channel our young people towards cognitive work. And certainly our education systems too often, and this is a particular problem in Britain, you're much better in Germany at this, prizes cognitive skills, general cognitive skills above other skills. So I think another characteristic of a good work society is one in which we are much more pluralistic in society in terms of what we value in people's work. Sorry to give such a long answer, but I wanted to give a kind of vision of what would need to be in place for a truly good work society.
But it was a very well-structured answer, Matthew. So thank you for that. But let me just try one quick question before we open this up to the Twitter public. When we talk about, the cognitive bias, as you call it, cognitive elitism, there's many books coming out now. One of the most popular ones would be Michael Sandel, a U.S. professor, who says the problem of cognitive elitism at the heart is our notion of merit, our culture of merit, right? That people actually think they earned the social position, they earn their, extremely high pay and so forth, and that's why they're allowed to look down on all those who don't have that kind of pay. So there's merit actually in the way there. Sometimes I think this is a very, specific US of A perspective, because I perceive inequality and the notion of merit very, very early on pushed, even in elementary school, to be much more in the forefront than I perceive it in Germany. I cannot really tell about the UK. What would you say? Is merit actually at the heart of cognitive elitism in the UK as well, or are you actually at a different place than what Sandel talks about for the US?
No, I think Sandel, I think America is, at the extreme end in terms of a society which calls itself a meritocracy, even though it is not, and therefore has the worst of all worlds, which is to say that it has a world of inequality and limited social mobility, in which those who are successful, most of whom are successful because of inherited advantages and privilege, have been propagating an ideology which says that the reason they're successful is because of their merit. And a number of writers have demonstrated, we all know that this simply isn't the case, that to a large extent, that your success is down to a combination of privilege and good fortune. So yes, I think that's particularly acute in America. I think, as in many other areas, Britain is a kind of, closer to America, but not nearly as good as Germany and other parts of Northern Europe, for example, in having a more egalitarian ethos. And indeed, I don't know if it's the case in Germany, but certainly in Scandinavia, there's a kind of disapproval of people who are too successful or too showy in their success, which of course is absolutely not the case in America, not really the case in Britain either. So I think that, that's part of it. We have an education system where qualifications are normatively based. That is to say, the education system determines that only a certain number of children can succeed. And then we have a system which really values one particular set of skills above all the rest. So that's, again, a kind of double narrow system, and a narrow system with a limit to the number of people who can make it. And, I think our education system is in desperate need of radical reform. And I think those assumptions will be looked on one day as being terrible. So, this is wound up in it. And, what we need is for good work is we need, as I said earlier, we need societies which respect all different types of work and all different types of contribution, and which are less unequal, so that the choices that you make, the contribution you make, is one which can be based on your own preferences and what you want to do and what you feel good at. A lot of this is about inequality, but, some of this is about middle-class people who would have liked to have been carers or would have liked to have been plumbers, but have felt that, if they didn't go to university and do a social science degree, they would somehow be deemed to have failed. So we, certainly in the UK, we do not have a genuinely kind of pluralist world when it comes to the way in which we value work.
Thank you, Matthew. You mentioned Max Weber a little while ago, and one of his important fields of research was actually the Postal Service, I believe. So I don't have an envelope here with you to switch to my co-moderator, Géraldine de Bastion. We don't do it with Postal Service here. We have Twitter. That's how much we progressed in Germany. I just keep on flattering the Germans tonight, right? So switching back to Géraldine and ask her what's happening on Twitter. What are the questions coming up? Géraldine, please.
Thank you so much, Tobias, and thank you so much, Matthew. It was fascinating to listen to your conversation, and I would like to share with you a question that did come in via Twitter and perhaps squeeze in one or two of my own, if I may. So Daniela Kolber asked on Twitter, this is a topic that I feel you've generally already covered, but perhaps a bit more specific deep dive. The Enquete Commission of the German Parliament found that private sector actors involved in vocational training and further education should be strengthened if digital transformation is to succeed. For instance, works councils are supposed to be equipped with a right to initiate further education, suggest further education activities for workers. And she was wondering if anything along the lines is being discussed in the UK as well.
No, indeed, tragically, and my heart sinks to tell you this, the UK government is actually withdrawing a scheme which funded trade unions to provide learning opportunities to workers, a scheme that had been extremely successful. And I'm completely bemused by this. And there is a real strong campaign to try to get them to reverse this measure. So I'm afraid, no, that sounds like a great thing. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about, I just want to say, because we're in this kind of area of further education training, one of the things I think we need to work on is kind of employability and generic skills. So, I think in Germany you're very good at vocational skills, and we are not nearly so good. But it's also going to be important in a world where people may have to reskill and retrain, that we think about the kind of generic, sometimes called life skills, soft skills, employability skills. And one of the things I pressed the UK government to do, they haven't really taken it forward, but there's various initiatives that I'm trying to push forward, is to start to think about these generic skills in the school curriculum. So these are things like leadership, initiative, creativity, problem solving, communication, digital literacy, which are skills you can use in a whole variety of settings. And again, one of the things I would like to see, and I don't know whether you have anything like this at all in Germany, is I would like to encourage employers to use a more generic systems in terms of the way we design jobs and the way in which we assess people's performance in work, so that, if you do lose your job, and, I think automation will accelerate following COVID, for no other reason than the reason that Adair Turner gave, which is that robots don't get sick. So if we do see automation accelerate, we do see people having to change jobs. It's going to be more important to capture the element of one job which is relevant when it's transferred to another job. So that's something I think we need to work on, so that nobody feels that because they've lost job A, they have nothing to show for it. Because actually they will be able to demonstrate skills that are relevant in that job to something different.
Thank you very much, Toby. Sorry, looking at you across the room, do we have time for one more, or shall we?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, I'll squeeze in one, and I'll try to combine everything else that came in. So maybe as just a point of departure, I'm not sure if this is a reviewing recommendation from my side, because it's terribly depressing, but last year I got to present the German launch of the film Sorry We Missed You by Ken Loach. I was wondering if you'd seen that, Matthew. It brings up a whole nother load of issues where we can actually, like that you've spoken about, where Germany seems to be a little bit more on top of things when it comes to social control of platform economy and things like zero-hour contracts that were featured in the care industry. So I just wanted to bring that in the conversation. And the question came in via Twitter of, what are the core risks of digitization for labor and the labor market, but workers' rights foremost. So I wanted to throw in that because that came in via Twitter.
It's really important, and I could talk about it for hours, but I'm going to be really brief. And there's 3 points to be made here. The first is I defend flexible work because there are many people who work flexibly, gig work or 0 hours work, and that is a form of work which suits them. And I think that is okay. We shouldn't be stopping people working in ways they want to work. And certainly some of these forms of work are useful, for example, to workers who have caring responsibilities, who find it hard to be able to predict when they can work, or semi-retired people who want to be able to work a few hours here and a few hours there. So I think there's nothing wrong with flexibility. The RSA, the organisation I run, we have a beautiful house in London. Do come and visit us when lockdown has finished. We have weddings in our house every few weeks, and we employ staff and pay them well to come in and work on those weddings. But we couldn't employ those staff long term because they just come in and they work on a Saturday occasionally and serving in those weddings. So I'm not opposed to those forms of work. But the first thing is you need genuine two-way flexibility. And there are things I recommended, some of which the government has done, but some of which they still haven't done, to make sure that flexibility is genuinely two-way. And those are things like fines if hirers cancel shifts too late, a minimum notice of shifts, that flexible workers have the right to request permanent hours and consistent hours after a certain amount of time in the work, and that the employer has to publish how many requests they've had and how many they've exceeded to. So flexibility isn't a problem, but we want two-way flexibility. The second thing to say is that the big issue about gig work is it has largely grown in a tight labour market. It's largely grown where there were enough people wanting taxi journeys or enough people wanting pizzas delivered. It was a seller's market for labour. Of course, that is not the situation now. And already we are seeing lots of stories in England of people coming onto their app, their Uber app or their Deliveroo app or whatever it is, and there's no work. And what you see there is risk transfer. What you see there is those platforms are able to push all that risk onto the people who work for them. And that is not acceptable in my view. And that's a real problem with the platform economy. And I suspect that we are going to expose that unfair risk transfer much more acutely in a situation of higher unemployment. And then the final point is that, which we haven't got time to get into, but these forms of work are often problematic in other ways as well. They can drive down they can have a chilling effect overall, because companies that work in more conventional ways and employ people in more conventional ways find themselves priced out. And they can also be problematic in terms of tax, because a lot of these platforms characterize the people who work on them as self-employed. Self-employed people pay less tax, and so that has an impact, a fiscal impact as well. And interestingly, when the Chancellor in the UK unveiled the package to support self-employed people in COVID, he said we're going to have to look again at the way we tax self-employed labour. So I think we are going to see shifts in this area in the coming period.
Thank you so much for putting that all those points into that answer with a short time given. So I'll pass it back to you, Toby, and another thanks from me and the audience to you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine, for that perspective you gave us. There, we're actually due to finish any time, Matthew, but there's something that's pressing. Let's try to answer that in a short amount of time. I mean, the unemployment numbers in the UK are actually below the German rate now, roughly 5% to just about 6% in Germany, although that's hard to compare, we know, because there's different definitions of what employment means actually between the UK and Germany. But it's probably safe to say that for a couple of years, the labor market will be quite volatile. We don't know what's going to happen. It may rise considerably, actually. We don't know that for sure, that moment. So what do you think about ideas like the universal basic income, the UBI? Would that, is this a certain measure that would actually be effective for the future, or are there other terms of policy in terms of corporate governments maybe, so what the companies can do for themselves? What's your take there? To close.
Yeah, my goodness, you asked these brilliant questions, and I have to think, how do I answer them in 1 minute when I would like to answer them in an hour? Look, I hope.
Oh, we lost you there, Matthew. What about transmission? That's a real cliffhanger, ladies and gentlemen. Matthew, are you with us?
Yeah.
We lost you there for a second. You said you hope. That was a real cliffhanger.
I hope we will see a much wider and more ambitious conversation about work in the post-COVID world. And, we don't have time to talk about the specifics of this, but yes, universal basic income, for me, it's not an anti-work policy. It's actually a pro-work policy, because it improves work incentives, because unlike most forms of welfare, you don't lose it if you get work. So actually, it strengthens. On the one hand, it strengthens work incentives. On the other hand, it improves people's well-being and gives people the scope, if they're doing work that is unpleasant, that isn't fulfilling, isn't going anywhere, to step out and think about maybe retraining or setting up a business or doing something different. So yes, I believe in UBI, but not because, as some idealists put it, I believe in a right to be lazy. I believe in UBI because I think it will lead to a more civilized, more secure system that offers people more opportunities. But also, you in Germany have led the way, or your trade unions have, in negotiating shorter working weeks, which is something you've been able to do partly because of your productivity successes. But I do think that debates around the working week and the working life will also grow. We have population aging as well, and more people wanting to work beyond retirement age. So, a bigger conversation about work. We have tended over recent decades to think that work is a given, that it is a kind of function of the nature of the economy, and we can make adjustments and we can deal with rough edges and improve things, but in a sense, the nature of work is a given. And I think it's time to change that, and it's time to say, no, ultimately, A good society is one that brings good work for all, and we must be willing to consider more radical, more fundamental ideas, not just policy, but also, as you say, organizational forms and our own individual choices, the way in which we lead our lives, that we need to bring this together. And we need to bring it together in a way that is practical and realistic in the challenging circumstances we find ourselves, but we need to bring it together in the context of a vision of a world where all work is good work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Most of these talks have a rather bleak outlook, especially at the end. This talk doesn't have that bleak outlook. And as a German, well, I don't even have a German passport, but as somebody living in Germany, I feel almost empowered after this hour talking with you. So thank you so much to you, Matthew, in London for being with us and all your insights from your long career. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We're going to continue with DigiCap, and I would like to tell you about two highlights, I think, of this remaining conference. On Thursday, November 24th, there will be a forum panel on online shopping and home office and what this means for city development. This panel will be in German, hosted by my colleague Sabine Reinhold. I think you have to enroll, you have to enlist some register for this panel beforehand, and then you get the link, and you can participate for free. Of course. A week from today, on Wednesday, November 25, I will speak with Francesca Bria, president of the Italian National Innovation Fund, about, that's the title of the conversation, Rocketing into the Future. What opportunities does crisis policy offer for a fair and sustainable economy in the wake of COVID-19? So that will be the next highlights. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Geraldine, for being with us. I already thanked Matthew. Stay safe. Have a good evening. Take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.